start the academic feast. Preferably, we'll stick to time. Before we start, I would like to learn how many speakers are available in the first session. Mr. Naresh Kumar, Mr. Is it Rajesh Kumar? Something. Is he available? The first speaker? No, not visible. Can you raise your hands? That will be convenient. Those speakers available. Only 1, 2, 3, 4. That's a good number. It's a good number. Welcome. So, I think first speaker Kailash Kumar. It's very difficult to read, microscopic. So, then if he is not available, we welcome the second speaker. Is it Mr. Vikash Agarwal available? Yeah. So, I welcome Mr. Vikash Agarwal, and his talk will be Management of Fracture Mandible by External Fixators. Dr. Vikash.
पॉइंटर जो पॉइंटर ये वाला है कि आपका मैं टाइम स्टार्ट करूँगा. सुनिए एक सेकंड है. Good morning everybody. I'll be speaking regarding management of fracture mandible by external fixator. Fracture mandible is commonly encountered in clinical practice, and most of them are compound due to proximity to oral cavity. The etiology are various, majority being motor vehicular accident, then next coming assault, and rest sports related or work related. The types are simple, displaced, comminuted, compound or pathological. This is a pictorial depiction of the same. Hogg and group classified mandible fracture depending upon the parts of the mandible, and it was found out that condylar fracture and angle and the symphysis and parasymphysis area fractures were the most common. The clinical features that commonly presents with pain, swelling, malocclusion, deviation towards the side of fracture and restriction of movements. These are a few clinical photographs of our cases with fracture mandible. The diagnosis can be confirmed with just simple routine radiological evaluation. If it is in doubt, then a 3-dimensional reconstruction or a 2-dimensional axial image can be taken to know about the finer details. The management available are variety, starting from barrel bandaging, elastic straping, interdental wiring, dental arches, plates and screw fixation or external fixation, each having its own pros and cons. These are few of historic importance, the splints and bandages. Then the interdental wiring and the dental arch. And finally the open reduction and internal fixation using plates and screws. What we did was, between May 2009 and October 2012, with a mean follow-up of 3 years, 30 patients admitted to us with fracture mandible between the age of 15 to 65 were managed with external fixator system, and they were evaluated clinically and radiologically. The patient's position was supine, and under local anesthesia or mandibular nerve block along with sedation, a trial reduction was achieved. Then Sandspin or KY were used and final reduction was done, and then it was finally tested with occlusion of teeth. These are few of the photographs. The post-operative reduction and radiological and clinical photographs of another case. And a third case. The evaluation post-operatively was done clinically by alignment of teeth, mouth opening and any other complications, and radiologically for accuracy of reduction, again teeth alignment and union. The results. All our patients had union, 2 patients had malocclusion which required manipulation, which was corrected in one, but in another ORIF has to be done. 3 patients had pin tract infections which was superficial and was managed with oral antibiotics only. Finally, discussion. Barrel bandaging and elastic straping are temporary methods, and when interdental wiring or dental arches are used, it compels foods abstinence. And open reduction and internal fixation may be disastrous in some conditions with hemorrhage infection, and it is not indicated in compound and comminuted fractures. So finally, to conclude, taking all these things into consideration, in our study we found that external fixation of fracture mandible is a better procedure because it allows early intake of food, carries minimal chances of infection, and there are least complications due to anesthesia and surgery, and the chances of union are quite high. And in case there is any malocclusion, the procedure can be manipulated in a subsequent sitting. However, definite opinion requires further trials in skilled hands. Thank you.
Any question to Dr. Agarwal? Okay.
Sir, everywhere in compound fractures, the normal treatment is to put an external fixator. Why have you said that we should not put an external fixator in compound fractures in this case?
So, open reduction and internal fixations. So, for plate and screw fixation, so it is better avoided in compound and comminuted fractures.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't get it.
Yeah. Any more? No. Thank you, Dr. Agarwal.
Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Mr. Vaibhav Basud. Who is the second speaker? Your good name, please? Okay, Mr. Vaibhav. His subject of talk will be hemisoleus flap.
Good morning all. I am presenting a prospective case series on hemisoleus flap repair in the management of compound grade 3 fracture of tibia. Open grade 3 tibia fracture is always a challenge for us. Complications like soft tissue infection, hampering wound healing, osteomyelitis, delayed union and non-union are very common. Early vascularized soft tissue coverage is mandatory in such injuries. Availability of plastic surgeons can make this very easy. But at a government institute like ours, making a plastic surgeon reach to every needful patient is not possible, and the substitute being an orthopedic surgeon doing local flaps for coverage of open fractures. Open fractures of leg with grade 3 injuries compromising bone coverage are very common, and defects of middle third of the leg can be covered using hemisoleus flap. Now the question arises, why only hemisoleus? Because soleus is a large broad bipinnate muscle with independent neurovascular supply to both medial and lateral halves and less functional sequelae in the donor area. It has greater arc of rotation, can be oriented more longitudinally, and medial half is supplied constantly throughout its length by perforators from posterior tibial artery. This is the picture showing comparison of soleus flap with hemisoleus flap, and you can see more of the bone can be covered using a hemisoleus flap. This picture showing the origin and insertion of soleus muscle. Our study conducted at Department of Orthopedics, MKCG Medical College, Berhampur, with 8 patients included who had open grade 3 tibia fracture and who presented between October 2012 to September 2013, which included 5 males and 3 females with a mean age group of 38 years. All patients were operated within 5 days and the defect size range from 3.5 into 1.5 centimeter to 12 into 4 centimeter. Procedure: wound debridement done and external fixators are applied. Skin incision was made 2 centimeter posterior and parallel to the medial border of tibia as shown in the diagram below. Existing open wound was extended to the incision, soleus identified and dissected from gastrocnemius. Selective division of perforators from posterior tibial artery are done and medial half split longitudinally from lateral at the level of raphe. Flap transferred to cover the defect, sutured to wound margins with absorbable suture and covered with a split thickness skin graft. Donor side closed over suction drain were required and dressing done on 5th and 7th day. This is the photos of the first patient in which hemisoleus graft is done and wound is covered with a split thickness skin graft. This is the picture of second patient with a similar injury. This is the third patient in which there was skin necrosis in the area surrounding the wound and has to be covered with a hemisoleus skin flap. This is the picture of the fourth patient who was a female patient, uncontrolled known case of diabetes. Flap coverage was done, but later on the patient developed infection and flap failed. Result: 75% of the patient showed good result with good primary healing. 2 patients had infection which led to graft failure. 1 patient had diabetes, as the picture is shown, and in other patient having gross comminution, a bone piece with no soft tissue attachment is replaced at the fracture site, and this patient went into non-union following osteomyelitis. This is the picture of that patient. This is the table showing the patient's demographics. 2 of our patients had comorbidity of diabetes mellitus, one of which went into graft rejection failure, and one of the patient who had osteomyelitis and non-union. Management of high energy trauma requires multidisciplinary approach, and injuries that would have required amputation are routinely salvaged today. Open fractures of tibia are one of the common injuries encountered, and difficulty of soft tissue coverage can be solved using techniques like flap coverage. Soft tissue defects in open fracture of middle third of tibia can be covered using flap, hemisoleus being the best local option. With favorable geometry and vascular supply of soleus, hemisoleus is used with ease and success for closure of defects in the middle third of leg. Conclusion: management of open fracture of tibia is always a challenge for the orthopedic surgeon, and this newer technique is helping in primary closure of wound. This study shows that hemisoleus flap repair can give sufficiently good results even in the hands of orthopedic surgeons. We doctors remain students for all our life, so learning a new thing is always a delight, and lack of plastic surgeon is making it a need to learn and perform flap surgeries to treat patients in the best possible way. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vaibhav, for being in time. If there is any question to Dr. Vaibhav, we can invite 1 or 2 questions only. None. So, congratulations again. And I'll invite the next speaker. He is Dr. Jitendra Katiyar. Dr. Jitendra. And his subject is a retrospective, it's so difficult to read, comparison, study of reaming versus non-reaming nailing of fracture tibia, fracture shaft of tibia. Dr. Jitendra.
Yeah.
and he will be, please come forward. Your good name, please? Okay. And our next speaker is Dr.
Good morning,
Arpit
respected
Patel.
chairperson and available persons. My name is Dr. Arpit from Tejaswini Hospital, Mangalore, presenting on the fate of the large butterfly fragment in long bone fractures of lower limb. Today, in the long bone shaft fractures of the lower limbs are among the most common fractures encountered in the orthopedic practice, especially with the present day high velocity injuries. Comminuted fractures are challenged to treat because of their vertical and rotational instability, usually because of a large fragment which could be displaced in the different directions. Here is the AO classification in which B and C types are associated with the comminuted fracture. In long bone shaft fractures of the lower limb, the treatment of choice is intramedullary interlocking nailing, but in case of shaft fracture with large butterfly fragments, does the plan of the management and the treatment choice remains the same, or does it require open reduction to reduce the fracture fragments to avoid the complications? The objective of this study is to understand the fate of large fragments and its malalignment, and as to whether it will delay the union or lead to other complications like deformity, shortening and implant fatigue. In our study, we did 30 cases of closed fracture of the long bones of lower limb with large butterfly fragments more than 3 cm, which was treated surgically between 2010 and 2012 at Tejaswini Hospital, Mangalore. All fractures were treated with rimmed intramedullary interlocking nailing on fracture table without opening the fracture site. The reviews in which rotational malalignment, which causes into 10 to 20% patients, which is best corrected at the time of initial surgery, careful perioperative examination, and the rotational deformities on operating table is needed. More than 15 degrees of rotational malalignment, which cause significant symptoms and requires operative correction. Angular malalignment greater than 5 degrees, either in coronal or sagittal plane, which causes problems. The lower overall rate of angular malalignment is between 7 to 11%, while the non-union is between 2 to 8%. Infection is more common in the open IML nailing, which is around 1.5 to 10%, while in the closed nailing it is less than 1%. Shortening occurs most commonly when there is significant comminution and overage more than 5 centimeter, less than 1.5 centimeter is generally acceptable. This is the callus formation according to the distal different studies. According to Johnson et al., it was 13.8, in which they used encirclage wire. The Zuckerman and Tuzner, it was 13.5 and 18.2. In our study, we have assessed the size, rotation, angulation of the large butterfly fragment, and pre-operatively, post-operatively on day 1, 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, and at the end of 1 year. The union and fate of the butterfly fragment was evaluated. No internal manipulation was done. Wherever feasible, external manipulation was undertaken. In our study, there are 30 patients. Out of that, 28 was male patient, 21 femur fractures. According to AO classification, 4 were B1, 8 B2, 7 was B3, 4 were C1, and 7 were C3. We have also seen the rotation of the fragment, which was 0 degree in 12 patients, 0 to 45 degree in 7 patients, 45 to 90 in 6 patients, and other 4 patients it was 180 degree. Average shortening of the limb, which was 0.8 centimeter. Now average union, according to the different classification of the fracture, it was ranging between the 12 weeks to 26 weeks. Its average was 14 weeks. This is the case one in which the fragment is rotated 180 degree. It was treated with the closed nailing at the end of 4 weeks and 16 weeks. This is the second example which showing comminuted fracture with rotation of 90 degree, which was treated with the IML nailing after 16 weeks. This is the subtrochanteric fracture with fragment at the end of 24 weeks. This was comminuted wedge fracture at the end of 24 weeks. The union rate was 96.7 in our study, and which was delayed by 4 weeks in type C fractures and as compared to type B fractures. One patient has a superficial infection with 2% having shortening was 1.5 centimeter, and 2 cases union was delayed and was treated with bone marrow aspirate. One patient had non-union with bent nail, which was treated with exchange nailing, bone grafting with plating for better rotational stability. Here is the example which was treated with bone marrow aspirate, and it shows good union. It was a delayed union due to distraction at the fracture site. Now coming to conclusion, in a well done nailing of a comminuted long bone fractures, the fragment incorporates with the parent bud and doesn't significantly delay the union irrespective of the rotation of the fragments. So attention should be paid to maintaining the length, rotation and the axis of the limb, and ensure that there is no distraction at the fracture site. Thank you.
If there is any question, you are welcome. We can invite one or two questions only.
Doctor, one of the subtrochanteric fracture,
Please
there was
put your name first.
Dr. D.K. Jain from Indore.
Okay.
There was a subtrochanteric fracture where there was a coxa vera, with butterfly fragment going laterally. So you were worried only the union part, or you were functionally also worried about that thing?
We are worried about the functional also and the union also, but our main aim was maintaining the length, axis and rotation in case of butterfly fragment fractures.
So it means you will accept that coxa vera about 15 to 20 degree in the hip?
Yes, sir. Can you show? Can you show me the previous presentation on one slide? It was it's very large fragments.
We were studying the rotational element, whether it has any binding on the unit of the fracture. So that this, in spite of so much of growth displacement, the full callus is on. Only the time we have 2 to 3 days.
Thank you, Professor Shantaram.
Thank you.
Now our next speaker would be Dr. Kataria, and his talk is on retrospective comparative study of reamed versus unreamed nailing in fractures of tibia. Dr. Kataria.
Good morning. I am talking about the retrospective comparative study of reamed versus unreamed intramedullary interlocking nailing in fracture of shaft of tibia. Introduction. Tibia fracture are the most common fracture bone and occur at frequency of about 26 fracture per lakh population per year. Several methods have been used for treatment of this fracture, including compression plating, reamed or unreamed intramedullary nailing and external fixators. Among them, intramedullary fixation with nail has shown to be an effective method for treatment of shaft of tibia fractures. The choice between the two alternative methods of intramedullary nailing, that is reamed or unreamed tibia nailing, is ongoing controversies. Reamed intramedullary nailing has allied advantage of providing optimal biomechanical stability. However, reaming leads to damage to endosteal blood supply, bone marrow necrosis, compartment syndrome, infection, etc. On the contrary, unreamed nailing does not have above mentioned problems associated with reaming, but has less mechanical stability as compared to reamed nail. Aims and objective of the study: to compare the outcome of reamed and unreamed intramedullary interlocking nailing in closed mid-shaft of shaft fracture with respect to duration of fracture union, functional outcome like early knee flexion, early weight bearing, post-operative complication like infection, osteomyelitis, non-union, delayed union, knee and ankle stiffness, implant breakage or failure, pulmonary embolism. Materials and methods. All cases, 100 cases were treated with either reamed or unreamed intramedullary interlocking tibia nail at Krishna Institute, Medical Science, Karad. This is a retrospective study from December 2010 to 12. Inclusion criteria are the closed midshaft tibia fracture, age group 20 to 60 years. Exclusion are the open fractures, pathological fractures, polytrauma. Protocol: data of 100 patients, 50 treated with primarily treated with reamed intramedullary nailing and 50 with unreamed nailing was collected. In all cases, hollow intramedullary interlocking tibia nails were used with proximal static and distal locking bolts. All cases were evaluated on the basis of available documentation about functional outcome and radiographs at post-operative 6 weeks, 3 months and 6 months. Implant behavior was studied by radiological evaluation done with X-ray at 6 weeks, 3 months and 6 months post-operatively. Functional outcome was evaluated on the basis of knee flexion, early passive and then active, weight bearing, post-operative morbidity and complications. Instrumentation for rim tibial interlocking nailing, instrumentation for on-rim. Surgical steps are followed. Symmetrical surgical steps are followed in both groups, except rimming was not done in on-rim cases. In our study, 67 patients are male, out of which 31 rimming was done in 31 patients. 53 patients are fall in the age group of 20 to 40 years. Fracture union was evaluated on the basis of soft callus radiographically, which was found at 47 in rim patient and 46 unrim at 6 to 8 weeks. Early weight bearing, partial weight bearing was started in 47 patients with rim nailing and 46 in unrim with 6 to 8 weeks post-operatively. Complication, 3 patients with rim nailing and 2 patients with unrim have post-operative infections, whereas there is 3 cases of delayed union and 4 cases of and 4 in unrim cases. This is a case of 40-year male with history of allowed history of RTA with right tibial shaft fracture, treated with rim interlocking tibial nail. Functional outcome at 24 weeks. Case 2, 35-year-old male patient, case of mid shaft tibial fracture with unrim intermediary interlocking tibial nailing. Functional outcome at 26 weeks. Case 3, this is a 20-year-old female with allowed history of RTA with left mid shaft tibial fracture, treated with unrim intermediary interlocking tibial nail. In this patient, there is a delayed union. At 6 months, we have to done dynamization of the tibial nail. Overview of result. Average fracture healing time was 22 to 24 weeks in limb and 24 to 26 weeks in nailing. However, difference in rate of clinical union, clinical outcome, time of weight bearing and complication in both groups were not significant. So we concluded from our study that there are no clear indication or contraindication or advantage or disadvantage to favor either rim or unrim nailing over each other. Fracture union, fracture functional outcome and rate of complication are similar in both groups. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Arpit, for a nice presentation. We have plenty of time for questions now. So I invite maximum number of questions. Unfortunately, there is none. Professor Shantaram Shetty.
Though it is a small series, it is well known now that from the Edinburgh group and almost all groups all around the world, the rim nail is the answer for any fracture, closed fractures of the tibia, and including open fractures now. So it is a little, you have shown just 2 weeks of difference in the clinical union, which is rather difficult because entirely an intramedullary nail has to be reamed and fitted well, especially of the lower limb, especially of the tibia and the femur for the weight bearing. So if you do not ream the nail, you cannot fit in the correct fitting nail. So you ream it 1 to 1 millimeters more and then fit in the nail. That's the principle which is taken. That's why.
Doctor, how do you calculate?
Please name yourself first.
From Indore.
Okay.
Again. How do you calculate the reaming part, means which nail should be fitted and which should not be fitted? If you go back to your principles right from the beginning, when it was not an interlocking era, that time they used to say that over-ream it. What is normal reaming, what is over-reaming, and what do you mean by the reaming?
Could you understand his question?
Yeah.
Do you need to reply or? Okay, no problem. We have, I'll request Professor. Yeah.
See, any nail which has to be reamed to 1 to 1.5 over reamed, and then the nail had to be fitted in. Otherwise you cannot hit. Otherwise you'll get stuck. And in an unreamed nail, many times you do not know the size of the nail. You are likely to you will get stuck much more. So it is imperative that a reamed nail has to be put in, especially in the lower limbs. For an upper limb, it's all right, humerus, we just put in, you can, the AO has the nail, which unreamed nail you put in. Even that they emphasize, if the correct, very good fitting nail, it has to be reamed.
How you decide whether you should put the 9 mm nail, 10 mm nail or 11 mm nail?
No, you sequentially go into reaming. Yeah.
Actually you go.
Yeah.
But right from the beginning, suppose echinus is swaying,
Yeah.
then 9 mm is tight.
Yes.
Please come to the mic.
Yes.
So what size of nail, 9 mm, isthmus is swaying, that is a tight.
Yes.
So you go 1.5
1 to 1.5 more.
more.
Yes. That's the principle.
Like the 9, 10 and 11 nail, which should be put.
No, pre-operatively you can assess, now you have software to assess your medullary cavity, number one. The pre-operatively in your radiology department you can assess what exactly is the girth of the medullary cavity, so you can fit in. Per-operatively you always assess by your reamers, so that you have a sequential reamer, so you go on reaming it. So
Next question.
Dr. Srinivas.
Thank you, Professor Shantaram.
One question. Sir, you said it is not much difference between reamed and unreamed. How it differs from the literature? And what is second question is what is your view on open fractures, reaming or unreaming?
Open fractures are mostly, according to literatures, in closed fracture there is no much difference in outcome of, regarding fracture union and outcome, functional outcome. In open fracture, some literature says that it is well to do unreamed nail as to prevent the infection to go into medullary cavity and again to prevent the endosteal blood supply to cut off and heal in the fracture union. So there is mixed views in open fracture, but in closed fracture there is no much significant difference in reaming.
Thank you. Let it be the last question. And now I invite our next speaker, who will be Dr. Sridhar KG. And his subject of talk is comparison of locking, compression and limited contact dynamic compression plate for shaft of humerus fractures. Dr. Sridhar.
Yes, sir.
Welcome. Please start.
Good morning, everyone. My presentation is on comparison of locking compression and limited contact dynamic compression plate for shaft of humerus fractures. Introduction. Incidence is about 3% of all the fractures. Open reduction internal fixation with plating is generally accepted as the best method of treatment for displaced diaphyseal fractures of the humerus. In conventional plating, actual stability results from the friction between the plate and the bone, which in turn may prevent periosteal perfusion. The biologic plating ensures a sufficiently stable fixation of the bone fragments, allowing early mobilization without major disturbance of the vascularization. The limited contact dynamic compression plates was said to reduce the bone plate contact by approximately 50% to minimize the disruption of periosteal blood vessels. It still relied on plate-bone interface for stability, and the problem of confluent contact areas was not completely resolved. Locking compression plate with combi hole was devised by combining the features of LCDCP and a PC fix. Theoretically, this allows for preserving periosteal blood supply, thus more rapid bone healing besides decreasing bone resorption, delayed union, non-union and secondary loss of reduction. But reports on the results of clinical application of LCP are few, especially on its efficacy or superiority over the other plates in the treatment of diaphyseal fractures of the humerus. Hence, we considered it is worthwhile to conduct a comparative study to assess the superiority of LCP over LCDCP, if any, in the treatment of fracture shaft of humerus. Objectives: to study the difference in the functional outcome following treatment of fracture shaft of humerus with LCP and LCDCP, to study the difference in the duration of union and complications of fractures treated with these plates. Materials and methods: it's a prospective randomized comparative study which was carried out from October 2011 to September 2013 in Bapuji Hospital and CG Hospital attached to JJ Medical College, Davangere. In this study period, 40 cases of fracture shaft of humerus were treated by open reduction and internal fixation using LCP and LCDCP, that is 20 cases from each group. Patients were randomly assigned to either of the groups after block randomization with a random number table. The clinical histories of these patients were also reviewed. LCP with combi hole and LCDCP 4.5 mm system of 6, 7, 8 holes were used. Inclusion criteria: patients with displaced fracture of shaft of humerus who have given their consent for the procedure, patient aged more than 16 years, and closed humeral shaft fractures and type 1 compound fractures. Exclusion criteria: patients aged below 16 years, patients not willing for surgery, pathological fractures and medically unfit for surgery. Operative procedure: anterolateral approach was used in all the cases except for the 6 cases where we used posterior approach. In LCP fixation for axial compression, plate was first fixed with a locking screw after reducing the fracture, followed by conventional screw in the opposite fragment. Locking head screws were used for the rest of the screw holes. For the bridging technique, only locking head screws were used. We uniformly use bicortical locking head screws. Physiotherapy standard protocol of mobilization exercises were started from second post-op day as far as patient's pain permitted. Patients were advised not to lift weight or putting additional stresses. And patients were followed up at 1, 2, 3, 6 months and 1 year with regular radiographs. And the results were evaluated on the basis of fracture union, range of movements and subjective complaints according to Romans et al. Observations: coming to the age, more number of cases were between 20 to 50 years of age, and more than 50 years, only 7 cases, 4 in the LCP and 3 in the LCDCP. This is the age incidence. The mode of injury: most of the injuries were caused by road traffic accidents and domestic accidents, and some were fall from the height. On the side of injury, in LCP group right were 8 and LCDCP 12, and in left LCP group were 12 and LCDCP was 8. The level of the fracture: most of the fractures were in the middle third, and the type of the fracture: transfer fractures were more in number in the LCP group, and oblique fractures were more in the LCDCP group. Coming to results, the time taken for surgery, LCP fixation mean time was 87 minutes with a range of 75 to 130 minutes, was found to be more than that required for LCDCP with a range of 60 to 110 minutes, but this time difference was not significant. The time of union duration in weeks which we give: in LCP group 10 fractures healed before 14 weeks, in LCP group 8 weeks, and to conclude, almost all the fractures healed before 18 weeks. The mean time of union for the humerus fixed with LCP was found to be 14.16 weeks in comparison to 16.27 weeks for the LCDCP group. Functional assessment: LCP excellent were 18 cases and LCDCP 17, and good 2 cases in LCP and LCDCP 3, and there was no poor results. Complications: there was superficial infection in 1 case in LCP and 2 patients in LCDCP, radial nerve injury to 2 cases in each, and delayed union 1 in LCP and 2 in LCDCP. This is the clinical photographs, radiological photographs, and this is the clinical photographs. Another patient, LCP group, LCDCP group clinical photos. Coming to discussion, open reduction and plate fixation has been the gold standard treatment of diaphyseal humerus fractures, but the most effective type of plate fixation for diaphyseal fractures of the humerus has not been well defined. Locking plates, the internal external fixators, does not rely on the frictional force between the plate and the bone to achieve compression and provide absolute stability. Thus, the local blood supply under the plate to be preserved, thereby leading to superior bone healing and minimal complications. It has been proved to be valuable in situations like osteoporosis, comminuted fractures, complex intra-articular fractures, or fractures in close proximity to the joints. LCP fixation was found to consume more time compared to that required for LCDCP. This time difference was statistically not significant. Our study had a...
Please conclude. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any question to him? Okay, please finish with conclusion.
Conclusion, limited contact plating is an effective treatment option for fracture shaft of humerus. The present study could not prove the superiority of LCP over LC-DCP. It is the proper application of the principles of the plating and not the type of the plate which decides the outcome. And further, long-term multicentric study is required to prove behaviors of the implant.
Thank you.
Sir. Thank you, sir.
Any question to him? Yeah, Professor Shantaram.
Your second line, the present study could not prove superiority of LCP over LC-DCP is correct. LCP has no, your age group has been all been below 51 years of age.
Yes, sir. Only 4 cases are
LCP has a very definitive indication in osteoporotic patients and complex fractures, as you said. And number two, you said you have fixed the LC screws first and then the conventional screws.
One first
no, it is not. It is not that. See, you would have to put the conventional screws and then the. Once you have put the locking screws, you cannot put in these screws. That has to be. That part has to be corrected.
Yes.
Let's see. And this does not have an. See, you must understand that LC plates are very stiff plates, whereas LC DCPs can be molded.
Yes, sir.
Humerus as a bone. From the cylindrical bone, it becomes a flat bone and a triangular bone, especially in the middle third, the lower third fractures. So it has to be molded to the contour of the plate. So many of the studies have proved LC plates in an younger individual, LC DCP are better than LCPs. And the cost wise, almost LCPs are almost double the cost of an LCP.
Thank you, Professor Shantaram. We are always benefited by their experiences. Friends, we have Professor M.S. Ghosh amongst us. He is a very senior orthopedic surgeon of Howrah, Calcutta. He has been a past president. I would like to have his comments on this subject. We want to learn from your experiences.
I think Professor Shantaram Shetty has already told what I wanted to tell. When I'm putting that LC-DCP or LC-DCP especially, you must have the compression, the conventional screws first, and the compression should be at the end of it. For once you apply the compression, you can't change it. So do the other conventional screws first, and then finally have the compression screws at both ends, so that it is for locking. Compression is the locking screws at both ends and the compression screws in between.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'll again ask if the first speaker, Mr. Rajesh Kumar, has turned up. No. Then I invite the last speaker of this series, Dr. Raghvina Tripathi, who will speak on outcome of locking compression plate and cancellous bone grafting for treatment of aseptic atrophic non-union of humeral shaft. Dr. Tripathi.
Good morning, Chairperson, seniors, and dear colleagues. I am going to talk on outcome of locking compression plate and cancellous bone graft for the treatment of aseptic non-union of humeral shaft, studied in Department of Orthopedics and Traumatology, Mariampur Hospital, Kanpur. Even with the use of best available implant, non-union occur and will continue to occur in future. Ashley Cooper was the first one to describe non-union in the year 1842. Zredny, a co-founder of CICOT, first classified and introduced surgical technique and was first one to use large cortical grafts for the management of gap non-union. Basic principle of non-union treatment and biologically activity-based classification was given by Weber and Check in their book Pseudoarthrosine, and still it is the state of art in the field of non-union. The rule is compression and stable fixation and technique over technology. So we should properly use the biological technique now which we are using, biological plating, that means minimal periosteal stripping. Periosteal stripping should be avoided as far as it is possible. Previously we used to see the bone itself before plating, but now it should be avoided. It's a classification on the basis of Weber and Check. It's a biologically active and biologically poorly vascularized kind of non-union, and accordingly the mode of treatment is to be chosen as a stable osteosynthesis or osteosynthesis along with bone grafting. Number of humeral shaft fracture non-union increased at the time when plating became popular, and it decreased when the braces was the treatment of choice, and rose again recently when intramedullary nailing was introduced, as by René K. Martini. Sarmento, a great propagator of conservative treatment, he has a series of 620 patients, and non-union rate was 2% for closed and 6% for open fractures. In our study, 28 cases of non-union of humeral shaft fracture between 2010 to 2012 were treated. The study population comprised of 10 males, 18 females, average age of 42 years, and average period since primary trauma was 8 months. 12 among 28 had undergone already previous surgery with failed implants, 7 nailing, 3 DC plating, and 2 locking plates, and all without bone grafting. In our study, no infected patient was included. None of our patients had radial nerve palsy preoperatively, and all patients have good elbow range of motion preoperatively. Shoulder range of motion could not be assessed preoperatively in our patients. All the fractures were managed by open reduction internal fixation with locking compression plate and cancellous bone grafting using posterior approach. Radial nerve was identified and dissected free of pseudocapsule, and pseudocapsule was excised. Bone ends were freshened whenever it is needed, and medullary canal on either side was opened, and even we used to put the bone graft inside the also, and shortening of fracture lengths when it is needed has been done. This is a case of 46-year-old female, interlocking nailing done elsewhere, operated 6 months back, presented with a broken nail and a non-union. Intra-op, we removed the nail and we have applied a locking plate. Applying the locking plate it is important, as already been emphasized by Professor Shantaram, that we should put the compression screws first, and only then we should apply the cortical screws. And the thickness of the plate is to be chosen as according to the thickness of humerus itself. That means small or narrow locking plate according to the thickness of the humerus which is going to be treated. It is a 6 weeks follow-up and 12 weeks follow-up and solid union at 3 months. And these are the functional results. It's a 2-year-old neglected non-union with pseudoarthrosis, again managed with the same principle. It's a post-op, 2 months follow-up. These are the functional results. Another case, elsewhere done, nailing. As you can see, nail was quite large. At the beginning, from the beginning itself, it is a 8-month-old fracture, and there is dissection at the fracture site that led to non-union. Intraoperatively, and at 3 months after following the same principle, there is a solid union. And these are the functional results. This particular lady has a poor shoulder range of motion because of the impingement by the nail over the past 8 months. Another case of 7-month-old non-union, it is managed again and successfully with the locking plate. Just putting a locking plate is not enough. It is good to follow biological principle and do less and less periosteal stripping, but one should apply the plate and centralize the plate over the bone. It is very important, and contouring of the plate is very important. We cannot apply a plate in this way, as after removal of the implant, this was the scenario, and in this particular case, we have applied a DC plate because he was a young patient and he did not require locking plate itself. And solid union at 3 months. This case was included just to show that locking plates are not the last answer. Radiological results evaluation. Normal union, appearance of bridging callus and partial obliteration of the fracture site within 5 months. Delayed union, union evident at 6 to 8 months. Non-union, no evidence of union at 8 months. And malunion, varus or valgus deformity of more than 15 degree, anterior or posterior angulation of more than 15 degree, rotational deformity more than 15 degree compared with contralateral side. Follow-up period was an average of 15 months, ranged from 6 to 26 months. We have compared our study with another study of non-union management with the interlocking nail, and we found that union rate, the duration of union in our study in LCP group was earlier than the interlocking nailing group. Most of our patients fall in 12 weeks, they go into union. Functional results evaluation. If the active range of motion of elbow and shoulder was reduced, patients were unable to return to their pre-injury work or activity after operation, or patients have unrecoverable neural injury, functional results were deemed unsatisfactory, otherwise functionally considered satisfactory. At the final follow-up, all patients have a normal elbow range of motion. Shoulder range of motion was normal in all patients except one with prominent interlocking nail. One patient with temporary radial nerve palsy that was recovered, and one patient with superficial stretch line infection that also managed. As a conclusion, the removal of previous fixation device, refreshing of non-union site, and fixation with LCP and supplemental cancellous bone grafting is effective and therefore recommended for the treatment of non-union of humeral shaft fractures. Thank you.
Thank you, doctor. If there is any question?
What is the additional advantage of using locking plates?
Your name first.
I am Dr. Pankaj Shandan from Kanpur. What is the additional advantage of using locking plates in younger patients? Why not use DCPs, easily moldable, cheaper, serve the same purpose when there is no osteoporosis?
Yes. Thank you for the question. As I have already seen in one of my cases that when he is a young patient, we do not follow the locking plate principle in all the cases. Locking plates are to be used in cases with long-standing non-union, which again lead to sometimes weakening of the bone, and locking screws give a better strength, and also in older people. Because these are non-union bones, they are usually porotic, and the normal screws don't have such a good hold as compared to the locking screws.
Yeah, Professor Shantaram.
Because of the non-union, bone become osteoporotic.
Yeah, that is what the non-union leads to porosis of the bone, and that is why locking plates are used.
There is a porosity in the bone, and if you use the normal DCP, a locking plate will not work. Locking has to be used, not the ordinary.
Even using the locking plate, one has to apply the compression screw first. Compression at the fracture is most important. Why locking plates are failing? It is because just applying the locking screws, not using the compression screws first. So application of compression screw at the beginning is important, and molding of plate should also be there.
Professor Shantaram.
Already we had a discussion on this issue of the LCP and LCDCP. What is important in a non-union is to freshen the bone ends, make it vascular, and the bone graft. And the length of the plate which you use, that is paramount. Once you really rejuvenate, the ends of the bones are vascular, and many of us, we put a fibula stud graft with corticocancellous graft. It is the graft which is more vital. And as you rightly said, in one or two cases you shorten the bone. In the humerus you can shorten the bone. What is important is to bring about vascularity at the particular fracture site. And the length of the plate is also, whether you use an LCP or LCDCP, the longer the plate which you use, it will bring about better unit.
Thank you, sir. Actually, what we used, as you are telling about the cortical structure of a fibula, we use a long cancellous chips of the bone and put it inside the medullary cavity just like a cream roll.
Thank you, Dr.
Tripathi.
Thank you.
Sir, one more question. Sorry, one question.
So, now we have the last paper. I'll invite Dr. Siddharth Shah to present his paper on comparison of MRI findings with arthroscopic findings in internal derangements of knee. Dr. Siddharth.
Good morning everybody, I am Dr. Siddharth Shah from Kunshan Institute of Medical Sciences, Karat. My topic is comparison between findings of MRI with orthoscopy in internal derangement of knee. Introduction. The vast majority of knee injuries result from direct trauma to the joints or is caused by torsional or angulatory forces. Injuries vary in severity from simple ligamentous strains to complex injuries involving ligamentous disruption with meniscus damage and associated fractures. For evaluation of traumatic knee, history and physical examination, radiological evaluation, and orthoscopy are done step by step. Orthoscopy and open surgery are the gold standard to diagnose the intra-articular knee pathology. Small randomized control trial in the National Health Service, that is NHS in England, suggested that MRI might reduce the orthoscopy rates and improve patients' outcome. 5 other observational non-randomized studies in the UK, Austria and the United States showed that MRI was cost-effective before the knee orthoscopy, and 25% to 50% of patients on a waiting list of surgery avoided orthoscopy by the prior use of MRI. MRI has revolutionized diagnosis and management of intra-articular pathology and ligamentous injuries. Being non-invasive and a highly sensitive tool of investigation, early and subtle changes in the soft tissue often are picked by the MRI. Selective MRI is a completely non-invasive diagnostic modality, and there is no ionizing radiation. Many needless orthoscopies will be performed if every MRI report is taken at face value. The clinical problem is to try to avoid MRI for patients who definitely need the therapeutic orthoscopy and yet to prevent the invasive orthoscopy when there is no surgically treatable lesion. Surgeons who are less expert in this specialist field are well advised to request MRI in preference to orthoscopy for doubtful cases. The management of knee disorder may need neither. MRI is very useful, but as was once said of orthoscopy, it is no substitute for clinical acumen. MRI diagnosis of meniscal and ACL injury were orthoscopically compared. If there was not a significant difference in the results, the consideration could be given to obviate the need for routine use of MRI, preventing delay and saving expenses. Aim. The comparison of MRI findings with orthoscopic findings in internal dearrangement of knee. Objectives. To study MRI findings of various ligamentous and meniscal injuries of knee and orthoscopic findings of the same patient. The methods and materials. This was a prospective study involving 30 patients of knee injuries with the basis of intention to treat from May 2011 to November 2013. Thorough clinical examination was performed. MRI was done in patient after taking history and clinical examination to confirm diagnosis. The MRI was specifically done in severe knee injuries and other knee injuries not responding to conservative management. Clinical MRI orthoscopic findings was documented. MRI and orthoscopic findings were compared and analyzed. A clinical diagnosis was made by performing tests like McMurray's test for meniscal damage, anterior test for crucial ligament injuries, and varus and valgus test for the collateral ligament injury. After clinical test, MRI was done with dedicated magnetic extremity coil of 0.3 Tesla strain that we use in our institute. Radiologists were provided with patients identifying data and provisional clinical diagnosis. Orthoscopies was performed under spinal, epidural or general anesthesia. Operative findings were documented and in operation theatre, which included anatomical structure involved with presence or absence of a tear or injury, its location, status of articular cartilage, and additional details are when available. Inclusion and exclusion criteria. The age group 18 years to 65 years, gender male or female. Inclusion criteria, it includes patients with history of trauma, complaining of pain, swelling, difficulty in walking, slipping of joint. MRI should be done three weeks after the acute injury. Exclusion criteria: bony injuries of knee joint, open injuries, non-traumatic internal derangement of knee, cases in which MRI cannot be done, patient unfit for anesthesia. Materials we use: MRI machine, 0.3 Tesla, orthoscopic equipments, orthoscope, fiber optic light source, television camera, accessory instruments. The observation and result, the sex distribution. Significant numbers of patients were males, that is the male percentage is 76.60%. Maximum number of patients who suffer knee injuries were in the age group of 30 to 39 years. That is maximum from 30 to 39 years, 43.3%. The side involved, left knee joint was found to be more commonly involved than the right knee joint. Motor vehicle accident was the most common mode of injury. Structure injured. Anterior cruciate ligament was the most common structure injured in the knee injury. Structure for ACL, medial meniscus and lateral meniscus are more involved. Interpretation of p-value. P-value was highly significant for ACL, middle meniscus and lateral meniscus. And there is poor agreement for kappa value. Sample cases. These are the sample cases. 20 years male patient, left side mean wall. Orthoscopic findings of that patient: patellofemoral joint tracking normal, supraorbital pouch normal, ACL complete tear with cyclops nodule, lateral meniscus small stable tear with minimal fraying, lateral femoral condyle, minimal osteochondral defect, and pathology of ACL tear. These are the clinical picture photography of that orthoscopic. This second case orthoscopic findings: ACL cut on empty notch sign positive, lateral meniscus horite tear on the inferior side of lateral meniscus plus superior surface. Conclusion: knee joint injuries are common. The need to accurately evaluate the knee injuries is very crucial for proper management and outcome. Otherwise, it will lead to chronic disability to the patient. MRI should be used in connection with the clinical findings and history to provide a more complete picture, especially in complex injury. As history and examination alone may be unreliable, less clinically evident situation, however, MRI still
Please conclude.
MRI still remains the only available means to diagnose in acute painful knees. In the situation of chronic instability with clinically noticeable findings, MRI may not be significantly valued, hence can be avoided with clinically proven cases of knee instabilities. Our study found that the accuracy of MRI scan in diagnosis IDK is decreasing order of ACL, PCL, MM and lateral meniscus.